Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're talking about a war that changed the world, cost millions of lives, and yet somehow it got stuck with the nickname the Forgotten War. You know, it's that conflict sandwiched right between the massive world-defining fight of WWI and the televised chaos of Vietnam. So let's figure that out. Why forgotten? We're going to dig into why this war even started, look at the absolutely insane high-stakes gamble that flipped the entire conflict on its head, and see how its legacy is actually anything but forgotten today. Okay, so to really get the Korean War, you have to get the world it was born into. See, after World War II, Korea wasn't just set free. Nope. It was basically sliced in half, right at a line on the map called the 38th parallel. The Soviets propped up a communist government in the north, and the US backed a capitalist one in the south. This wasn't just geography. It was the new front line in a worldwide panic over one thing: communism.
And back in the United States, that panic had a name: the Red Scare. It was this deep, gnawing fear that communists weren't just some far-off threat. They were here, hiding in plain sight, maybe even living next door, working to bring the country down from the inside. And this wasn't just some fantasy. People were seeing headlines that seemed to prove their worst fears were coming true.
You had the Alger Hiss case, for example. This was a guy high up in the State Department, and he gets accused of being a Soviet spy. Now, he was technically convicted of lying under oath, not spying, but that didn't matter to the public. The damage was done. For a lot of Americans, this was stone-cold proof that the enemy wasn't at the gates. He was already in the building.
And then you get the Rosenberg case, and everything just went to another level. A married couple accused and then executed for handing over secrets to the atomic bomb. Suddenly, the fear wasn't just about spies in the government, it was about our biggest, most terrifying weapon being given to our biggest enemy.
So with all this fear swirling around, America came up with a foreign policy called containment. The idea was pretty simple. Wherever communism tries to spread, we have to be there to stop it. Full stop. So when Soviet-backed North Korea blasted across the 30th parallel on June 25, 1950, President Truman didn't just see it as a border dispute. He saw it as a test, a challenge that America absolutely had to meet.
And that North Korean invasion? It was like a lightning bolt. They were so fast, so powerful. Seoul, the capital of South Korea, fell in just a few days. And in a matter of weeks, the South Korean and UN forces were facing total, complete defeat. They got pushed all the way down into this tiny little pocket in the southeastern corner of the country, around a city called Pusa. It became known as the Pusan Perimeter. This was it, the last stand. Their backs were quite literally against the sea.
And inside that perimeter, things were just awful. They were running out of ammo, they were hugely outnumbered, and it was the middle of a brutal summer heat wave, all while facing constant attacks. For the soldiers trapped there, it must have felt like the end was inevitable.
So what do? How do you possibly get out of a trap like that? Well, the UN commander, General Douglas MacArthur, he came up with a plan. A plan so bold, so risky, that a lot of his own commanders thought he was completely out of his mind.
His big idea? Forget trying to push out of Pusan. Instead, he wanted to sail around the entire enemy army and land his troops hundreds of miles behind their lines at the port of Incheon. Now, Incheon was a terrible place for a landing. It had 30-foot tides, massive seawalls. It was a defender's dream. And that's exactly why MacArthur picked it. He bet everything on the idea that the North Koreans would never, ever expect an attack there.
And on September 15th, it worked. The gamble paid off, big time. The landing at Incheon was a complete surprise and a massive success. It completely severed the North Korean supply lines. The army attacking Pusan just crumbled. Suddenly, UN forces were the ones on the attack, recapturing Seoul and racing north.
It looked like the war was almost over. Victory was in sight. But as UN troops got close to the Chinese border, a whole new enemy entered the fight. China sent what they called volunteers pouring across the border. But these weren't a few volunteers. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of soldiers.
And just like that, everything changed. The victory march north turned into a desperate, freezing retreat south. This new phase of the war was unbelievably brutal. You had legendary fights like the breakout from the Chosin Reservoir, where Marines fought their way out of a trap in negative 30-degree weather.
This new war created a huge clash between the president and his top general. Truman was terrified of starting World War III, so he wanted to keep it a limited war. But MacArthur, he wanted total victory. He was publicly calling for bombing China, even talking about using nuclear weapons to win.
So, Truman did something that shocked everyone. He fired MacArthur. It was this huge statement about who's really in charge, the elected civilians, not the generals. But even with MacArthur gone, the war on the ground didn't change. It just bogged down into this horrible stalemate right back where it started, around the 38th parallel. It looked a lot like the trench warfare from World War I.
For 2 more years, they fought and died over the same hills, gaining and losing very little ground. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed. The fighting stopped. But the cost? Well, you can see it right there. It was just staggering. Over 36,000 Americans died, and Korean casualties, soldiers and civilians, were over 3 million.
And here's the thing. That armistice wasn't a peace treaty. It just paused the fighting. It created the Demilitarized Zone, the DMZ, which is now one of the most heavily armed borders in the world. And it left the two Koreas technically still at war, even today.
You know, for a lot of people, their main memory of the Korean War actually comes from a TV show, MASH. It was set in Korea, but it was on the air during the Vietnam War. And its theme song, with that haunting title, Suicide is Painless, perfectly captured the dark, absurd feeling of a war that just felt endless and tragic to so many.
So, the Forgotten War? Maybe it was forgotten because it didn't have a clear victory or a satisfying ending. It started from a fear of communism, was almost lost, was saved by an incredible gamble, and then just stopped. But when you look at the world today, with the tension on that peninsula, you realize its legacy is very much alive. A war that, it turns out, is anything but forgotten.